This video is just going to start off with talking about how Lin-Manuel Miranda has used musical motifs, but really it's about something larger, like Marvel Cinematic Universe large. No, wait, bigger. The Tommy Westfall universe large. But before we get there, I have to show you how this all came about. And yes, we're gonna end up talking about Schmigadoon, which will end up changing how you see In the Heights and Hamilton and possibly every other musical. Ready? Let's go. It all began with a theory that I first started to think about when I was analyzing Hamilton. Certain melodies kept returning, which Lin said he learned from Les Miz. Typically, this type of returning melody is called a leitmotif, where a musical melody or chord progression, or even just a rhythm, represents a certain idea, person, object, etc. And you see these melodies repeated all over the place. I've covered this in countless videos about Hamilton, and specifically about the Les Miz connection in How Hamilton Makes You Cry Part 2, but I have barely scratched the surface of what a leitmotif actually is. I mean, if you look at Les Mis, almost every melody is repeated at some point in the show. The bishop's song becomes Empty Chairs and Empty Tables.
Come in, sir, for you are weary. There's a grief that can't be spoken.
Come to Me becomes On My Own.
Come to me on my own.
Who Am I becomes One Day More.
Who am I? One day more.
The list of leitmotifs in Les Mis goes on and on and on, unless, well, your musicologist Joseph P. Swain, in his book, The Broadway Musical, he disagrees with calling these leitmotifs, but rather calls them contrafacta, or in singular form, contrafactum. A contrafactum is a melody that is recognizable
Himachi, what are you doing?
and brought back.
Presley, you're doing it now too.
But when it's brought back, it's not used to represent a specific idea, person, or object, but rather just returns with new words.
You need to focus and stop singing that melody. Oh no, now I can't stop it. Help.
Sung by a new character without any direct relationship to the original version. And despite the complicated sounding Latin terminology, you've encountered contrafacta in your life. Ever notice how the alphabet song, Twinkle Twinkle Little Star, and Ba Ba Black Sheep all have the same melody but unrelated lyrics? That's contrafacta. And we see these melodies with unrelated lyrics all the time in Les Mis. Why would the bishop song turn into Empty Chairs and Empty Tables? One is a bishop encouraging Jean Valjean to be a better person, and the other is Marius mourning the death of all his friends. And why should Fantine's song on her deathbed turn into Eponine's torch song? According to Swain, this kind of violates what a leitmotif is supposed to do, which is represent something in a very specific way. For example, if the bishop song came up every time we saw the bishop, or if Fantine's deathbed song returned as Jean Valjean's death song, which it does. And so that's probably a better candidate for a leitmotif. But then why would that same deathbed melody then become Eponine's song of unrequited love for Marius? So according to Swain, On My Own is a contrafactum. I think Swain was looking at the leitmotif versus contrafactum issue through the lens of opera, which requires a certain narrative consistency. If a melody that represents a sword, let's say, suddenly gets played during a moment that has nothing to do with the sword, the audience will start to wonder whether that melody actually had anything to do with the sword at all. Pretty soon, that melody's meaning will be diluted into meaninglessness without that sense of consistency. However, Les Mis' melodies don't really lose their effectiveness when they show up as contrafacta. In fact, On My Own is one of the show's most popular and memorable songs, and it's quite literally a contrafactum because it was not in the original French version of Les Misérables, but only shows up later in the English language version of the show, and that's why its melody is lifted from Come to Me and then given new lyrics. In spite of itself, it still works. So what's going on? Well, I couldn't think of a theory to explain how Les Mis' leitmotifs worked until it finally dawned on me watching In the Heights. I believe Lin-Manuel Miranda learned the lessons of Les Miz and codified those lessons into In the Heights and later Hamilton.
I think Les Mis was the first musical I ever saw, and I was 7 years old. I remember my parents bringing home the cast album, and I remember my mom crying every time she heard Bring Him Home.
So what was the lesson? Well, it comes down to the first sounds we hear in the Heights. In the film, it's a Spanish language announcer over a song being heard on the radio. That song is an old bolero called Siempre, and appears throughout the film, especially at the Rosario family dinner, where they all sing along to it and comment how the record gets stuck at a particular part.
Scratching the record is my favorite part!
And Siempre also comes back as the lead into the finale, where part of it is sampled into the beat that Usnavi starts to rap over.
Lights out on Washington Heights and now the crack of dawn.
This old song, Siempre, has been part of this neighborhood and this community for decades. Audience members have even told Lin how much they remember their own grandparents listening to Siempre. Except that never happened. It's not an old song. It's a song that Lin wrote specifically for In the Heights in order to sound like an old song. And this is accentuated by the song being distressed with vinyl crackle and hiss and a lo-fi style mix. This all creates a sense that Siempre has been around for, well, always, which is what the word siempre means. So in a real sense, when the song Siempre comes up again and again and again, it doesn't necessarily represent a specific idea or person like the leitmotif does. Instead, it represents a feeling, a mood. It's a song that the neighborhood vibes with whenever it feels the need to vibe with something. But can a leitmotif represent a general vibe? I have a feeling Swain wouldn't think so. A vibe is too loose, doesn't have the rigor of a true leitmotif. But then again, Swain is looking through the lens of opera, where music drives the narrative. If you shift that lens into a different context, because Lin-Manuel Miranda's lens is not the operatic tradition, but the radio. After all, Siempre being played on the radio is how the film begins. The stage show goes even further, beginning with a radio channel surfing montage where you hear half a dozen songs from the show being heard in snippets as somebody is turning the dial from station to station. And how do songs work on the radio? Well, when you turn it on, you hear whatever the DJ happens to be playing at that moment. That DJ is going for a vibe of some kind. Sometimes the format the DJ is working in dictates that kind of vibe. For example, slow jams for the radio format known as Quiet Storm.
The Quiet Storm.
The original Quiet Storm.
The Quiet Storm.
The magic Quiet Storm.
Now, sometimes the music you hear on the radio doesn't really match the vibe you're looking for, and you just turn it off or change it to another station. But sometimes, serendipitously, it does match your vibe. Somehow it manages to match the exact emotion you're feeling at that time, and that vibe reminds you of a person, a place, an idea, and instead of turning the dial to another station, you stay there, feeling that feeling. And so Lin's leitmotifs tend to work like this, where he is almost like a DJ keeping track of how a piece of music makes the audience feel, and then he brings back that music when he wants the audience to feel that feeling again. And I think he learned this from Les Miz. The Contrafacta in Les Miz work exactly like this. Come to Me and On My Own are unrelated in narrative terms, but emotionally they're both about feeling hopeful within a state of despair. And so it makes sense that On My Own would appropriate the earlier song as a shortcut for the audience to feel that emotion, that vibe again. And it makes sense it would work that way because Les Miz was itself originally a concept album. That's right, it was pop music first. It's really a pop song score that works using radio-style leitmotifs. In fact, the earlier concept album turned musical Jesus Christ Superstar was similarly full of Contrafacta. So in my mind, this reconciles the Swain Les Miz issue. A simple paradigm shift from opera to radio fixes everything. But does it? I mean, it does, but does it also not open up a completely new can of worms, a sort of Pandora's box, if you will, of what music even is, and why music even exists in musicals at all? It's a crazy musicology black hole that threatens to suck up every single piece of music ever, and once again, it was sparked by In the Heights, which will be the topic of my next video, which is all about the insane rabbit hole that I went down in the musical theater matrix. Please subscribe and ring that bell to be notified when that next video drops. I'd like to thank all my Patreon supporters, including my newest patrons, Deborah Mulder, Kirsten Schiller, Jennifer Stewart, Andrew Wild, and Dan Hilton. Thanks for watching. Until next time, peace.